Shalom, Rabbi, and thank you for taking the time for this conversation as part of my program, Profiles of Faith. We are here today on the first day of Hanukkah, the 29th of November, Kaf Hei B'Kislev, with Rabbi Donniel Hartman on Zoom. Rabbi Donniel, where do I catch you right now, and how do you prefer to be called?
Donniel works great, and it's in my office here in Jerusalem.
In the Shalom Hartman Institute?
At the Shalom Hartman Institute, yeah.
About Rabbi Donniel Hartman. Donniel is a modern Orthodox rabbi and educator. He holds the Kaufman Family Chair in Jewish Philosophy, a prolific author, blogger, and speaker. He captivates large audiences all over the world. His thoughts, observations, and analysis of today's Jewish world and Israeli society are considered profound and refreshing. But beyond all this, he's the president of the Shalom Hartman Institute, a large organization that is responsible for numerous educational programs, from its high school, which provides education to 700 students, to educating teachers and principals from all over the country, to providing various programs to soldiers and officers in their army, to rabbinic leadership programs and summer programs for Jewish educators from all over the world, to arranging for conferences throughout Israel and North America and more. On top of this, Donniel is a family man, married to Adina, parents with 3 grown children. Wow, that's a long list. How many grandchildren so far?
4 grandchildren.
Baruch Hashem. How do you manage to do so much, and are your days still 24-hour days?
One of my great advantages, I'm ADHD. So while that caused me much misery as a child, because for me to sit in a classroom and to have to hear what a teacher says and then be tested by telling back what they said, I suffered. But now being ADHD, I have tremendous amount of energy, and multitasking is a normal day for me. So I'm in my zone, so I'm in a good place.
Well, let's hope you don't have to jump and do a couple of other things during this interview. To clarify, Donniel is an old, young friend, and I enjoy our friendship. Donniel, many people have money, titles, and accolades, but you have what Jews covet, want, and rarely find. You have yichus. Your father, Rabbi David Hartman, was an American-Israeli leader, a philosopher, a contemporary Judaism, author, and founder of the Shalom Hartman Institute. He served as an advisor to a number of Israeli prime ministers on the subject of religious pluralism and the relationship between Israel and diaspora. Tell us how it was to grow up in such a home.
My grandmother always spoke about the fact that we're the only ones who don't have yichus. So
with time, you get yichus.
With time, because we had no yichus. My grandfather was born in Jerusalem, and we moved to Israel in 1830. And the people who moved to Israel in the 1830s and 40s were those who were so underperforming they couldn't even make it in the ghetto in Hungary. So like we this is like, if you moved to Jerusalem, I never felt that yichus. If I did feel anything, and it's true, I did grow up with my father. There was a weight of responsibility from a very early age. When my father said to me, before I deserved it or earned it, he said, Donniel, you're responsible. And at a very early age, actually when I was 3, I was given a seat on the pulpit next to my father in his 1,000-family synagogue. There was the president, the cantor, the rabbi. We were in Abbas Torah together for so many years. Imagine on the bima of the shul, sitting there also an ADHD rabbi. I'm there. That's where, and this is, Donniel, where you belong. I didn't pick my profession. It was designated to me, and I was taught, Donniel, you're responsible. And so there was joy and fun and playing. But I grew up in a certain sense in the 17th century with a father who designated me as his
successor.
And designated not on virtue of any merit. It was pure nepotism, hereditary. I wasn't the oldest child, but I was the oldest son, and at that time, that's what mattered. But I grew up. I carried his books to every lecture he gave. It was a very, very intense upbringing, but it was an upbringing in which I was being trained to make a difference, to be responsible. And so it was as a young kid, it was also very invigorating, to be appointed, to be given a task which was so way beyond you. It was an honor, but mostly there was a sense of there was a weight of responsibility. I grew up with that as an inherent part of uh, of, of how I always saw myself, and we were pointed to something. Now, also there was lonelinesses because your father's enemies are your enemies. Uh, my father wasn't always someone who, or he didn't care who agreed with him. That's one of the things I respected the most about him. Very often I looked at various so-called revolutionaries within Orthodoxy. They never wanted to say anything that would cause them not to get a scholar in residence weekend at some young Israel somewhere. I was raised just by my father. He felt responsible to the Jewish people, to God, to the Jewish tradition. And if it meant walking alone, it was okay walking alone.
Did you feel the pain for him that people disagreed with him?
Not as much. He felt it very deeply, but then I felt it on my own. We people responded to us, to his children. I remember when I went to yeshiva, Yeshivat Hesder, which will remain unnamed, and there were 67 students in the first year of the program, and there was somebody who was appointed to be the head, the dean of students. He was a very sweet, sensitive, gentle man, and his job was to make everybody feel comfortable. And so we come to yeshiva. It was after 6 months in the army, and he met with every single student of the 67, asking them what are they coming, what do they need, how are they adjusting. He met with everyone except for me. And one of my friends asked him, "Why aren't you meeting Donniel?" And he said, "Oh, Donniel's a Hartman. We have nothing to talk about." He never met me. He didn't know me. So there was good parts, and but there was also there was baggage, but
It's complicated.
It was complicated, but it was embraced as part of who we are. Our job is to do what we believe, and we didn't look to the left or to the right and ask for consensus. Or I remember when I was a young child, very young, must be, I don't know, grade 2 or 3, I came home from school, and my father asked me, "Donniel, what did you learn in school today?" And by that, he meant, what did we learn Jewishly? He didn't know anything, math, sciences. I could fail in any of those subjects because Hartman's, we don't know that. So what did you study? And I said, "Oh, we were studying this chapter in the Torah." And he said, "Donniel, what do you think about?" And he asked me a question. I said, "Oh, Rashi says." And he started, he says, "Donniel, excuse me. I didn't ask you what Rashi said. I asked you what you think." Now, that's the way I was raised. And if that meant being alone, then that was okay.
Now I understand where you come from, because anybody who knows you and will go over it know how you insist to provoke people to think for themselves.
And I don't even try to provoke. I'm not even into being controversial. You have to say what it is. You have to say.
You're natural.
And if it makes you unpopular, that's okay. That's okay. Being alone is not the worst thing that you could be, by the way.
Talking about your father, from what I learned, he grew up a real starker, meaning a black hat, a graduate of the Chaim Berlin Yeshiva, a Lubavitch Yeshiva. He learned in Lakewood and later under the Rav Soloveitchik. But it all changed, as he's quoted to have said, "I was a good yeshiva boy until I started to read." Or as Charlie Buchholz wrote about your father, he would go on to smash the idols of his youth while remaining both deeply affectionate and perpetually enraged towards the ultra-Orthodox. Can you tell us about your father's change in heart and all of this oscillation?
I wasn't there, but he didn't grow up as a starker. He didn't grow up he failed actually elementary school twice. He was the children of immigrants who were literally hungry for food, and a completely, very, very difficult, partially dysfunctional family. And he only came to serious learning later on, after high school. His great love in life was basketball. And that's how he got a scholarship. Yeshiva University took him as a basketball player, not because of intellectual prowess.
This is something to to put in a plaque.
There's your personalities. And my father was a very independent man, and he didn't follow. He wasn't a follower. He tells the story of a meeting with him with the Lubavitcher Rebbe, and who wanted to recruit him to be part of. And he said, "I ran away so quick." It's that same look. My father was destined to do um, his path, but that the thing about him that I learned and that I think distinguished his whole career was a passionate search for truth. And in that sense, the Rambam was his teacher. And anyone who's my father's student, you can be a Kabbalist, you could be a specialist in any discipline, but that spirit of the Rambam, where love of God demands of you a love of truth, and that anything false about your tradition diminishes its divinity. And so it's not as if, oh, I believe in God, therefore I could accept. Quite to the contrary, precisely because I believe in God. As the Rambam says in Mor Nevuchim, part 3, chapter 31, it is precisely the divinity of the Torah which makes the demand that it coincide with truth necessary. And that was his career. And at the end, he had teachers, but he couldn't have rebellion at the end because he couldn't follow. He would take from and then move on and chart his own path.
Going back to growing up next to your father on the Bima, I remember once in a shul I belonged to for some years, they brought in a young rabbi. He was in the mid-20s. He was an upcoming star. And people said, what, he's just 3 years from rabbinic school. He has a smicha for 3 years. Then he was sitting with his son, Shai, learning with us. I remember it was Rav Kook. And all of a sudden I had an epiphany. This child of his, this son, like you with your father, he was 3 years old. So I realized he is now training for rabbinics. He had rabbinics 101 at 3 years old. So by the time he was 25, he had 22 years of training. So you may have looked young. I remember, you when you're younger, not much, but, we cannot tell how many years ago it was.
Over 30 years ago.
Yes. And you still are young, but we have to remember that when you were young, you already were an old rabbi.
As I said, I went through the 17th and 18th and 19th till I got to the 20th century. I had many centuries before him.
But does it feel pressure? Because a lot of people who have a legacy and inheritance and succession, rarely are they satisfied fully. They always feel the pressure to do more.
Now that I'm a grandfather, now I'm 63. But there is no doubt that when you receive something as a result of nepotism, it can either give you a sense of entitlement, or it can make you constantly work to make sure that you're worthy of it. I was the latter, and so I'm a driven person. There is no doubt that I'm driven, but I'm driven by a cause. My life has to make a difference in the life of the Jewish people. And if I'm not satisfied, it's not because of my past, it's because the destiny of all educators is we never succeed. Our job is just to move the needle a little bit forward. And if we move it forward, that's our job. And we're part of a 3,000-year-old chain of Jewish teachers. And so I'm one of those teachers. I'm a teacher, and I'm driven to do right by the Jewish people. It literally keeps me up at night.
The fact that they're never happy has nothing to do with you.
No, I'm not interested in. Remember, I'm a Hartman. I'm not into popularity. I want the Jewish people to love Judaism. I want the Jewish people to love each other. I want the Jewish people to have a Judaism which is worthy of their loyalty. I want a Judaism that reflects the best of what we as human beings know, and that represents beautiful values and deep meaning. I never resonated with being a light unto the nations, but we have to be a light. how do we do that, and how do we further that conversation? That's been guiding me now for, I'm a rabbi close to 40 years now. Someone sent me something that I wrote to students of mine 35 years ago, and I had just given the same speech. I don't even remember. I challenging and pushing. So it's been you're right. I'm not satisfied. Maybe some of it comes from the designation, and some of it comes from the enormity of the task.
I notice that when you talk, first of all, you have what many rabbis forget to have, which you smile. But I also noticed, in addition to smiling a lot, you look like you talk to yourself. You're trying to think it through.
Yeah, it's true.
The authenticity of a person who struggles with himself, it's truthful because you wouldn't lie to yourself.
Right.
If I hear somebody talk to himself, I say, that is what I like to listen to.
Thank you. I think that's true. There is no doubt. When I write a book, you write for yourself. I'm trying to make sense of who I am as a Jew, of my responsibilities in life. And maybe it's also an advantage of being a president of an institution in which your name is on the door or on the wall. In a certain sense, I want to have a great impact, but I don't live by that. I want to make a difference. But I remember an event, I gave a lecture, and someone raised their hand and asked a question, and I responded. And afterwards, they came up to me and asked, they kept on pushing me, and what? And at some point, I said to them, I'm really not a good teacher for you, I said to them. I said, I don't want you to think, I'm not being paternalistic, and I don't want you to feel that I'm demeaning you at all. I hear where you're coming from. I hear your religious world. I'm in a different place. So please, ignore me. I had a similar experience. I wrote this book called Putting God Second, How to Save Religion from Itself. And it was a whole group of 200 rabbis who were at this group talking to me about it. And the title upset this person. He just couldn't get over it. And he's coming back and back and back. And he says to me, how can I? said, you know what? I said, listen, what was my title? My title was Putting God Second. So if I could say Putting God Second, it's certainly possible to put Donniel Hartman and my book second. I know what it is that I know, but I never claim that which I know is the truth. This is what I know, and I teach it. And I don't want to be anybody's Rebbe. I don't have a desire to be a Rebbe. A key part of what I try to train is for people to be empowered listeners, to take what they want from me and to go on there. I'm the antithesis of a Rebbe. If anybody knows, I hate those games, and I don't want that. God gave the Torah to the Jewish people. God didn't give the Torah to me. I have access to Torah as one of the Jewish people. You are one of the Jewish people. I could share with you what I know. If it's beneficial and it helps your Jewish life, great. If not, not. I don't speak to, and I don't play games. Zero. No games. I teach that which is meaningful in my life. And my hope is that some people will hear and they'll take meaning from it. And if they don't, that wasn't my job.
But you may not be playing games, but you're playful. And,
Yes.
and that is not a wrong quality in a person. I know somebody who was the head of a big financial company. We're talking about hiring, and he said, I only hire people who play games.
Maybe I benefited from the fact that I was never a rabbi of a shul, because there's no job more lonely than the rabbi of a shul. And the congregants don't want to see you. People like you might, but they don't want to. You always have to act rabbinic. You remember when I was a rabbi of a JCC in Bergen County, and at Avos Torah, we were friends. We would go to the movies, we would go on vacation, we'd go. So I didn't have to play that. So, but sometimes you take the positions that fit your personality. Being a little immature also helped. So
yeah, well, we should never grow up. But what comes to me when you're talking about thinking and asking and searching for the truth, how do you recommend for a person who doesn't have smicha, who doesn't have much education, who is struggling with the truth, and there's so much confusion around, how do you search for the truth when the noise is deafening? And just when you're seeking the truth, how do you know?
You never know. That's part of the journey. But the first thing you do is you train people to trust their moral instincts. And anybody who undermines your confidence, both in your mind or in your moral instincts, comes from a school that I have no part in. And what I train people is that ask that question. Trust yourself. Torah doesn't sit on a tabula rasa. It doesn't sit on an empty, clean slate, which is your brain and your mind and your conscience. And it's not meant to infuse your life, to save you. I don't go for salvation. I was created in the image of God. You were created in the image of God.
But if not for salvation in the Christian sense.
No, not in the Christian sense. Salvation from your ignorance. Also salvation from doubt. That's not what Torah is. The Beit Midrash experience. It's true, this is my Judaism, and I know it's not right for everybody. The Beit Midrash experience is an experience in which there is no authority over your question. When you're in a Beit Midrash, the rabbi doesn't it's not, no. You're learning a text together, you're fighting, you're trying to understand the Gemara, you fight with it, you reason with it, you argue with it, but your mind counts. So I start by training people. Connect to yourself. Your moral instincts are the greatest source of your inspiration. The greatest source. When Avraham Avinu, this was one of the central texts of my own religious life. When Avraham Avinu in Breshit Yud Chet in Genesis 18 turns to God and says, "Chalila lecha milasot kadavar hazeh." It is a profanation for you to destroy the righteous together with the wicked. Will the judge of the whole earth not deal justly? He didn't stand before God and say, God, you're the one who knows, and who am I? I'm just but dust and ashes. No. When I know something, when my moral conscience tells me something, I have to stand by it. Now, that doesn't mean that my moral conscience is always right. No. My moral conscience grows. My morality has changed over the years. Hopefully, it's gotten better and better. I've become more sensitive to things that I wasn't sensitive to in the past. But at any given moment, Torah has to talk to what it is that your conscience teaches you is righteous and good and justice. And I train people to trust it, and that is the foundation with which they talk to Torah. And when they come as an empowered individual, then they're open to learning, because then they're going to hear ideas. They're not frightened. When I hear a great idea, I learn from it. I can get through all the noise because I'm standing. And then if an argument comes forth and says, oh, you know what? I didn't think of that. But if I'm frightened, then I can't even hear. I either have to blindly accept or blindly reject. But when I stand, then I can learn.
So on this, there's a big word in Orthodoxy, and that's called submission. Okay? Obedience. And numerous very enlightened rabbis, including the Rambam, claim that without submission and obedience as the first rule is very hard to accept. It's like showing up to class and saying, yeah, that person is a teacher and I'm a student. Unlike when I tried to tell one of my sons, Ori, do this, and he said, why? And he says, I'm your father. And he said, yeah, Abba, but I know stuff about stuff. So we all know stuff about stuff, but at some point we have to submit. We have to literally bow down.
No, we don't.
No, in acceptance that somebody who is our teacher. So
I'm an Orthodox Jew. I have no submission. And what's different about the Rambam is that submission is not the foundation of Jewish life. Love of God is the foundation of Jewish life. And there's difference. It doesn't mean, now I will observe. I have no problem observing, but that's not for me submission. There's nothing to do with submission. That's a decision. But I will not observe if it violates that which I know to be true.
You're running ahead of us. I'm saying, like Socrates is quoted to have said, whether he said it or not, said that I'm smartest because I know that which I don't know.
That's not submission. Socrates never submitted. All of Socrates' life, when Socrates said that, he was actually put on trial because he refused to submit. His whole journey, his life begins with this oracle, this dream, in which he is told that Socrates, you're the wisest man on earth. And he wakes up and says, but I don't know. What do I? So he goes all the Socratic dialogues are Socrates going and meeting the various people who know. And he engages in conversation with them and he discovers that they don't know. And at the end of his life, he indeed says, it's true, I am the only one, I am the smartest one because I'm the only one who knows that I don't know. But Socrates doesn't submit. He doesn't submit. The process of learning is not a process of submission. It's a process of acquiring knowledge only if you have the confidence that you can acquire it. It's a different move. So it starts when, the Rambam in his introduction to chapter Chelek says the highest level of worship is love of God. And what is love of God? He says love of God is to know that there's good and there's bad, and that it is worthy for me as a human being to do the good and to avoid the bad. And he says, do not be like a donkey who follows because of a rein or whatever this is called, a bride or a bristle. No, but what guides you, he says, is your humanity. So I don't submit. As a Jew, I am not called upon to submit. Now I appreciate there's a lot of people who would say that this is heretical. But as I said to you at the beginning, I'm not in the popular. That doesn't interest me. It's a different vision of religious life. It's a love of God, which is a joint journey between me and God in search of truth and in search of meaning and value. Sometimes it's going to come from me. Sometimes it's going to come from God. Sometimes it's going to come from other things that I learned. And at the end of the day, it's my job to bring them together into a voice of our tradition.
For people who get carried away in the philosophy here and say that it's a little bit heavy, I just want to echo something that I learned from you, and I had an opportunity to repeat it against this Shabbos at the table while I was a guest. And people were arguing over something, and they were very passionate. And one of them considered to have won the argument, and it was on a technicality. And I said, I had a rabbi once who gave a class on doing the Shema, the beginning of Brachot, Me'ematai, right? And Hillel and Shammai and the people argue whether you do it this way or that way, this way or that way. And at the end, they agreed that one is right, not because of the argument, but because he gave honor to the other student. And we know that Hillel and Shammai are the paradigm of the Gemara, because because argument, but because they married within each other, even though they argued. And I said, that rabbi taught me one important lesson that I told my kids: never win an argument because somebody tripped over his shoelaces. You have to help the adversary, to have a better argument. So you're winning. If you do win, is going to be honorable. And if you lose, at least you lost to a good argument. So I repeat your teaching.
It's 80% of what I said, and that's good. I'll take it. But someone remembers.
It was an old auxiliary minion of Avas Torah.
I remember that class, yes.
Yeah, so you should just know that all of your struggles, some water comes out and it even continues to flow.
Dayenu, that's all you could want.
Rabbi, I met you in the US, as you said, over 30 years ago, and we were friends in what seems to be a different world before internet, cell phones, social media. But you took it a step further. Your life in the US gave you a chance to make Aliyah again. And how has living in Israel impacted the American-Israeli Donniel I used to know?
First of all, I love living in Israel. And for me, to live in Israel is more, it's a joy, it's an honor, and it's a responsibility. To be able to participate in one of the most exciting moments in Jewish history, not to be a spectator in it, but to be able to be a player, is you talk about a life worth living. So part of the Donniel that I in my constant search for meaning, living in Israel is a gift, and there's also though a heavy weight, because the earlier part of my life, when I moved to Israel when I was 13, the big responsibility that I had, or that was placed on little boys in Israel, and you know this as much as I, in the 1960s when I made Aliyah after the 6 Day War, it was you're a future soldier. Your job is to protect the Jewish people. And so even though I don't use one eye, and even though my other eye is scratched, they made me a non-combat soldier. And I asked to be retested, and I cheated on the eye exam. And I became the eyes of the tank. That was a great genius move. And my first sense was, Donniel, you're one of the first Jews in history who are given the honor of being able to defend themselves. And that was a very deep part of my upbringing. Donniel, you can defend the Jewish. It was a very physical defense. When I then, after the Lebanon War, which was a hard war for me and my family, and I had to get out of Israel, I moved to Englewood for 11 years. When I came back, it was a different responsibility. Israel by then, and still now, is a success story. We're powerful. We're economically vibrant. It's like we're a story beyond comprehension. You think about
totally.
And like you saw, like you remember your upbringing in Israel, where you lived, and poverty and technology. It's just now. So the second stage of my being, it was I came from America, where I learned to be a teacher of Jews when I worked as a rabbi at a very large community center, and to teach all Jews. I felt the responsibility of how do I enhance and deepen the connection of Israelis. So many of them were alienated from Judaism. How do I enhance their connection to Judaism? And how do I also make sure that Judaism is a light? Because one of the challenges of Israel, and this has been a major part of my life and concern, is that in America or Canada, as a minority, you always want to give a nice spin on who you are because you're not powerful. You want, what do people think about you is important. Israel is one of the biggest ghettos that the Jewish people ever created. And we could be our own reference group. And we don't have healthy critics. We don't. And Israel, with its power, has a potential to abuse that power. And the responsibility of both making sure that Jews of Israel are engaged with Judaism and they don't buy into this secular religious divide, which I'm in, I'm out, who's in, who's like that either or story. And at the same time that Judaism is a force for good in Israel, and actually being in Israel, you can see how easy it is for the Jewish people to walk away from each other. Jews in Israel and Jews in America, like this, could walk away from each other. And making sure that we don't walk away from each other has been the third part of my life since I've come back here since '95.
You remind me, I was leading once a group of American Jews in Israel, and I tried to explain, we're standing in a neighborhood called Sarona, looking at what is the old central bus station, Tachana Markazit, which is today a beautiful neighborhood, and even the landscaping, they innovated the landscaping, they put vines, grapevines instead of regular bushes. And I said, you have to understand, we work on a parallel universe. When I came to Israel in the 60s, like you, but from a different place, consider yourself having landed in America after the signing of the Constitution. And so we are in Israel at time of your constitution. In the time it takes New York to build a 2nd Avenue subway line, we built a country.
Oh, we didn't build a subway.
Right.
A subway is going to take us 100 years.
When I was in the Technion, I tried to, as a substitute teacher, to help a kid with reading, and I brought him a book from my youth. I remember what it was, The Count of Monte Cristo, and that I read passionately in the 60s. And as I was reading it with him, I realized he didn't understand half the language. The language has changed in 10 years. So the country in which you lived in the 60s, when you came back, was a different country. So how do you spoke English, yet you grew up in Israel in the military, you were an officer in the tanks commander. You knew war and battle. How did the army change you, and having lived so many years in US, how is it to live in between those two worlds? And to add on to it, you returned to Zion, meant that your kids will serve in the IDF, thus you put your kids in harm's way. Was that a calculated risk? Many American Jews debate this decision. How did you and Adina deal with that? So I'm asking a lot of questions about this huge responsibility.
There is no doubt that the hardest decision you make in your life are decisions that affect your children's safety. That's by far. Moving back ideologically was easy. Even though there's enormous challenges in Israel, it's a gift to participate in them. When your kids have to go to war because of your decision, that's very tough. I was willing to die for Israel. I was willing to.
But your children?
Now, could I say to my children? So there is no doubt that you don't think things fully through. But I could tell you still to this day, the hardest moments in my life. I remember the day in basic training when Yitzi, my son Yitzchak, was in basic training, and they took them out of basic training and sent them to do their first guard duty at a checkpoint in Judea and Samaria. I said, no, I'm going. You stay home. I also remember he fought in Gaza. And back then, there was this interesting ritual in which Israeli soldiers in the Second War in Lebanon were constantly calling home. And then the parents were calling the army. So they said, we're going to there's a new ritual in Israel. Before you go into battle, they take away your phone. So there was this ritual now of the last phone call. Now imagine, normally, here it is Wednesday. So every time Yitzi would call, is this the last phone call? No, I'm just calling. But then I remember it was on Shabbat. I was in the middle of giving a lecture to a group of Israeli principals. And everybody, Orthodox, they knew this was Pikuach Nefesh. To get the last call was Pikuach Nefesh. And I remember getting the last call before he went to Gaza. Those are the hardest moments in your life. But at the end of the day, I have to live by the deep belief that to help and to be a part of Israel is the greatest honor of our life. My brother-in-law was killed, and so death, my terror, everybody, this is not theoretical. This is really close. But that's, other generations, they had to learn how to survive Auschwitz.
Yeah.
We have a different challenge, and I think this is what we have to do. And I respect parents. I understand parents who are petrified. But to be a part of Israel and to be a part of building Israel is not only a responsibility, it's truly the greatest honor of my life.
There is a line which you probably know its source, or how to say it better, which is to live for something. How do you know it's something worth living for? Is if you're willing to die for it.
Yeah, but it's tough. You should know. I can talk about it, and it's great to speak about it in a lecture, and I can speak about that. That's one of the messages of Hanukkah. It's a very tough one to live by, and it shapes you. It shapes you. It really does.
Personally, only now, my kids know a little bit about my army experience, but it took over 45 years to be able to write about it. So I just recently wrote a piece because I was during the Yom Kippur War, and and I know, not because we were hurt, we were willing to hurt, but to be witnessing to other people's pain scars you for life, and you take it with you.
Listen, I know. I still haven't, to this day, shared my wars with my children. I want my children to be spared some of my pain. That's our fantasy.
No.
It doesn't work. I know, but I know, but who knows? We wish.
Donniel, you're a prolific speaker, and when I hear you, I notice how you challenge your audience. We discussed that. A common thread through your teaching is to force your listener or reader to re-examine their personal or our collective dogma. We discussed that. But such is your recent book, Putting God Second, How to Save Religion for Itself. Now is your chance to tell us the pitch.
The pitch. Now I have to tell the story about the story. The thing that it goes back to something that I said beforehand. And it goes back to Abraham in Genesis 18. God and religion could be a force for good, but God and religion could also be a force for tremendous corruption. And we see that in our world. How much evil and pain is perpetrated and put upon others in the name of your faith? And maybe it's as a result of many of the experiences that I've had. I've seen how faith in God blinds people. Faith in God gives you a right to transcend your basic moral conscience. You're on a mission. So we all see it when, a jihad, and we could point to it. But there's little jihads that we do all the time where we insult people. We're all on a little holy war. We know what the truth is, and we know what's good, and we want to save you from yourself, and all of the above. And this is a book that speaks about how deep within our religious tradition, or the last line of the book is that when you put God second and you put morality first, you're fulfilling God's will. That God, the God that I worship, is not a God who wants obedience. It is not a God who wants to submission. It's a God who wants you to embrace your moral truths, to engage in your moral truths. It's Hillel. The central part of the book is when Hillel is asked, teach me all of Torah while I stand on one foot, or convert me on condition that you can teach me all of Torah while I stand on one foot. And he doesn't read the Ten Commandments, and he doesn't say submit to God. He doesn't even say love God. He says, what's hateful unto you, do not do unto others. That's the whole Torah, and the rest is commentary. And so this book is an attempt to look at where could religion destroy us? I use this analogy of autoimmune disease. Where is it that God and religion could attack its own goals, and where it subverts the ethical? How many people do we know who, in the name of faith in God, insult people? In the name of faith in God, hurt people? In the name of faith in God, judge people? So we could say, oh, they're getting it wrong. Oh, it's an abuse. That's easy, but it's not. And this book actually points to an inner flaw, and I believe that when you put God second, as I say, you're putting God's will first. And it's an attempt to tell a story of a life with God in which to embrace the ethical is the deepest fulfillment of that life with God.
So when people challenge you, don't you tell them, listen, Rabbi Sachs wrote a book not so different than mine called Not in the Name of God, I think. What's his name?
Right. I'm not worried.
Yet you're teaching, even in this conversation, which is not meant to be to PhDs, you talk and teach on a very high level to people who you assume you give a lot of credit to their constructs of the mind, how they can reason. Like, I learned the best on things I don't know well is I tell the person, imagine I'm a 6-year-old. How do you explain it in a way that is not deeply philosophical, that is not very complex?
I don't try to make it complex. First of all, I'm not a good teacher to 6-year-olds. So that's for somebody else. And again, I'm okay with that.
But somebody said, if you cannot explain nuclear science to a 6-year-old, that means you don't know it well enough.
I don't agree with that.
Okay.
Fair enough. I appreciate that. But that's what I was taught is if you can't explain your doctorate in 2 sentences, you don't understand.
Right.
Those 2 sentences don't have to be to a 6-year-old.
Yeah.
I think Judaism and our search for meaning are complicated. We're living in very difficult times, Sally. And I know that. And so there are great people, and I have great respect for people who could translate it to the 6-year-old. That's not my job. Mm-hmm. I believe, and this is the Beit Midrash that I grew up in and the essence of my work at the Hartman Institute, is that for Judaism to survive in the modern world, we have to compete in an open marketplace of ideas. And that competition I don't have to be esoteric. I don't have to use big words, and I don't have to quote and hide behind sources. But Judaism is a religion for serious people, and it's a religion for adults. And I want to speak to those adults. And as I said beforehand, my career's been okay because I found those adults who want to listen. And for others, I'm the wrong teacher, and that's okay. When you know that, you have to know your limitations. So I don't want to speak to 3 people, but thank God I'm not. And part of what I've discovered, Sally, and you discovered the same thing. People want something serious. We know a lot of people who could speak to say, and we get bored.
Yeah.
People want something serious, and hopefully I'm able to do that.
I mentioned to somebody that I'm going to interview you, and he said, "Oh, Donniel, is he Orthodox?" And that's my next point of discussing. One may think that you're a revolutionary, but in reality, you thread the needle very carefully. You're traditionally religious mainstream rabbi, are you not? You toe the line of halacha to its smallest clear law. So you're not New Age, you're not a revolutionary in the sense of halachic Judaism, even though you challenge people in ways that are confusing people about realizing who you are. So tell us about how do you toe the line and thread the needle at the same time?
I don't know if I do that well, and I don't do it for everybody, and I know that.
No, for yourself. You are a mainstream Orthodox rabbi. Is it clear? Is it clear that...
Am I mainstream Orthodox rabbi? No. I'm being honest to myself, I'm not.
In your Orthodoxy...
In my Orthodoxy, I observe Jewish law carefully, as long as it doesn't violate my moral principles. When Jewish law violates my moral principles, I believe that I am halachically obligated to not observe it. And I believe that when I do so, I am more committed to halacha.
Yeah, just explain, because we're not talking about saving lives right now. We go to shul, we buy chicken in a kosher place.
Very simple. So it's very simple. I go to shul, I buy chicken. That's easy.
There's no conflict in violating God's law in complex ways in your everyday Judaism, right? So this is not where you get that.
True and not true. Because you're right, 90+% of Jewish life does not activate does not violate or challenge my moral principles.
Right.
And whenever it does, even if I don't understand it, I have you keep it. I'm part of a system, I'm halachically obligated. But we'll take, for example, issues of gender equality.
Right.
That's here. I go to shul. I choose to go to a shul where women have an aliyah Torah. I reject completely the traditional role of women under halacha, and I think it has to be changed. And I change it in my life. So as you know, some people then, he's reformed, whatever. I don't care what people call him. It just doesn't matter to me. I know that throughout our tradition, halacha has always responded to the new things that we've come to understand at our time. And again, we don't want to make this into an esoteric lecture, so I'm not going to quote sources. But throughout, do you think that you and I, or that contemporary Orthodox Jews, we're living the same life that Moshe Rabbeinu lived?
No.
The same life that Rabbi Akiva lived? We didn't. So so the Chatam Sofer, I wrote my PhD on the Chatam Sofer. Moshe Schreiber, the founder of ultra-Orthodoxy in the 19th century, he comes up with the most innovative principle in Jewish history. Do you know what his innovative principle was? He said, whatever is new is forbidden under Jewish law. Now, that was the most greatest, this is the paradox. He wants to close down innovation by giving the greatest innovation. Now, I think Jews always innovate. Now, as an Orthodox Jew, I choose the places where I innovate. I keep, as you said, I keep kashrut and I keep Shabbat and I keep halacha. That's easy. Halacha and mitzvah are a vehicle for fulfilling my responsibility and my potential as a human being. And at the same time, my challenge, my responsibility, is those areas where it does not is to change it. Now, does that make me? It does. It'll make me less. I'm not mainstream in that sense because mainstream only do what everybody else agrees with. I don't care if I'm alone. It just doesn't bother me. Or mainstream will say that other denominations aren't authentic. I don't agree. I think conservative Reform Judaism and secular Judaism are just as authentic as my Judaism. It's not mine. So religious pluralism, treatment of the status of women, LGBTQ plus, all of these things are new places, are new truths that we're learning, Sally.
Yeah.
And I'm not frightened of them. I embrace them. And so I live an Orthodox lifestyle. Would I say that I'm a mainstream? That would be kind of difficult for me to say.
So this brings me to two questions or two topics, and I want to bring them both in the same breath. So forgive me about the lengthy part. We know that I think the biggest division in Jewish thinking is in deciding whether Judaism is adaptive or whether it's evolutionary. What I mean by that is it adaptive, meaning if there are microwaves, now we have a way to make using microwave or electricity or cars in a halachic way. That's easy, that's adaptive. But is it evolutionary, meaning, God chose Avram to be a light upon a nation after the Mabul, and he was supposed to bring civilization from a place to another place. That's evolution. So if we had slavery, if we had being able to marry more than one woman, moving to monogamy, those are evolutionary. These are not adaptive. So we had the Bet HaMikdash. Is the Bet HaMikdash, was it a goal or was it a tool? These are evolutionary questions. And, I think Voltaire had this line in Candide, the best of all possible worlds. If we assume that God has a plan and we are part in his plan, and this must be the best of all possible worlds, we're not in a mistake. So if it's the best of possible world, mean that it's an evolving process. Why are we so afraid of change when change is what we're here for? We are a vehicle for change, and yet we're afraid of change, which leads me to the second part of the question, and that's why I want to put it. But the people who are respecting that answer, which are not many, they will still say, yes, Israel, yes, Donniel, Rabbi, with all due respect, but what if? Look, what if? If we start doing this and this and that, it may lead to mixed dancing. It's assimilation. We're losing our people because we give them too many confusing choices. So it's like, as I grow older, I learned that the paradox is not the enemy. Only a poet can hold the paradox in his hands. A paradox is the beginning of a truth. Can you claim evolution, change, and yet at the same time not be afraid of the what if? Because if you do it with faith, you shouldn't be afraid.
You remember when I said that I'm not a teacher for everybody? I know when somebody is petrified of evolution, I'm not saying that they're wrong. I'm just saying that they're living in a different spiritual and psychological world than I do. I appreciate that you could look at the modern world and you can see the varieties and you can see the breaking down of boundaries. And you can say, I need order. I need something. I could appreciate that. I'm not frightened by that. I'm not frightened by choices. I believe that the greatest danger to Judaism is mediocrity. It's not change. The greatest danger is mediocrity. And the greatest danger within that is moral and intellectual mediocrity. And while it seems trivial that there's almost nobody walking around here thinking that the world was created 5,700 years or so ago, and that there were no dinosaurs, so that, and the world's not flat, and that the moon doesn't evolve around you. So those things on science, we Jews had no problem. Christians were more hung up about science. We adapted and said, science, truth, facts. With fake news, we don't buy. We don't do that story. If it's science, we Jews do science. So that, no matter what Judaism said, we do. But what about moral truths? Now, I understand that's frightening, and it's true. Things are changing all the time. But I'm more frightened by us failing to hear the call of of moral evolution as it comes to us. And it's true, it destabilizes. But I see this as a given permanent feature, just like you said. For me, one of the lines that I learned from Maimonides, and it comes from also Guide for the Perplexed 3, Part 3, Chapter 32. Don't worry, I'm not going to, won't be for a 6-year-old, but I'm not going to give you a headache. The Rambam says that even a perfect God cannot give an eternal Torah to an imperfect people. If people are imperfect, God has to give them what it is that they're capable of hearing. And therefore, by definition, embedded in Torah are moments that are eternal and moments that are temporary. And our challenge, and we don't know which one is which. Nobody gives you that's what's so frightening. Nobody tells you. Now, what are the eternal moments? And what are the moments that need to be challenged? So as an Orthodox Jew, if something doesn't make sense, I have no problem keeping it. It doesn't bother me. It's when it violates my moral principles that I know that at that moment I'm being called upon to redeem Judaism from its old, historically embedded idea, which was given to a people at one time. And it could be slavery, and it could be the attitude towards women, and it could be conversations about homosexuality, or one of the most important things which is central to Israel today is how do we talk about non-Jews? You know, the way Jews in North America talk about non-Jews as distinct from the way Israelis talk about it, it's two completely different things. And our tradition has a lot of work to do. Democracy. Do we abide by democracy? There are new things that we've learned. I'm not frightened by them. I embrace them, and I also don't play a game. I don't pretend as if, yes, Moshe Rabbeinu was a liberal Democrat. I don't like to play. No, Moshe Rabbeinu spoke the truth to 12th century BCE Jews. That's what the Rambam said. 12th century BCE Jews needed to hear A, B, C, and D. And our job is to embrace that. Our job is to learn from it. But our job is also
to move the
to
needle.
bring Torah constantly into the 21st, into the 20th, the 21st. That's what Torah Chaim is. A Torah of life is a Torah that not only enriches life and embraces life, but that is alive. Now, I know that for people is scary. And you know, I tell people, great, go to another teacher. I'm okay.
You know, it reminds me, when I interviewed Rabbi Zalman Schechter Shlomi, Zecher Tzadik V'Bracha, not everybody would use that word, but it's okay, you and I could. And I challenged him on the changes that he's a new age, was a new age rabbi. And he said, when we were growing up, he was a shaliach with Rabbi Kalbach, Zecher Tzadik V'Bracha, of the old Lubavitcher Rebbe. He said, having a talis that had colors in it was a major violation. Today, everybody has a colorful talis. He said, who knows what people will do in 25 years? Which brings us to the beauty in patience. We want quick solutions. One of the problems in democracy, and I live now in the United States, but it's true everywhere, we feel tormented that the Congress passes a law and it takes so much time until the Senate passes the law, then they have to move it to the president. They see it as an obstacle, and actually the fathers of this constitution, of this system, which is true about all democracy, made it on purpose. And you know what the purpose is? So you wouldn't pass a law so fast that you may regret. So it's okay. The things we're talking about today, don't be so fast to deny. Your grandchildren might be observing them, So in a way,
but that's okay too.
No, that is what I'm echoing what you are saying in a patient kind of. Let's have some humility here, because it's not only speaking in the name of God; it's speaking with conviction. And conviction is nice, but how do you know that you carry the conviction for the right thing? Maybe a little humility would help. And learning from all the wrong that has been done in the name of convictions can be a good teaching. So I want to conclude with something that it may be a way to bridge the gap in a humane approach rather than a philosophical approach. At your father's eulogy, who I knew and I still remember, and I remember once I came to Israel and I said, Daniel, could I interview your father? And you said, maybe call him. And I called, and it was not the right time. So you're speaking for both of you now, but in your father's eulogy, you said, we had a rule. If we were arguing, nobody was allowed to leave the room shouting. We had to hear each other out, continue to talk. Is that where you preach the tolerance? Have you managed to keep it going? I know that it's hard, and I see sometimes you stop smiling when you get carried away and you get very kind of.
Sometimes I leave the room. Sometimes with my father, we made our loyalty to each other, made sure that we never walked away. But part of the challenge today, and that's okay. It's okay. I don't walk away from any Jew.
That's what
I don't care if you're. I don't care. I am a liberal Orthodox Jew. Israel belongs to the Haredim just as much as it belongs to me. Israel belongs to secular Israelis, to traditional Israelis, just as it belongs to me. Israel belongs to Israeli Arabs and Palestinians, just as it belongs to me.
Can you explain that? Because I know what it means as an Israeli, but it's very hard for Jews all over the world who sees Arabs as our enemies, because that's what all they hear. So the way I say it is, many people want Israel to be Belgium. Arabs saved us from that. We are spared from being another Belgium. Not that I have anything against Belgium, but mediocrity and insignificance is really the enemy. Palestinian Arabs, and I lived in Jaffa among Arabs, and you live not far from Arabs. You know, you're 2 seconds away from meeting or driving or dealing with an Arab Israeli. They're not the enemy. Can you explain it to somebody for whom this sounds a little weird because they hear the news?
Sure. Now there's again, as you know from Yafo, my daughter lives in Yafo, and this is also now a major part of what the Institute does. Israel has 80% Jews and 20% Israeli Arab Palestinians. 10% of them are Christian, 10% are Druze, 80% are Sunni Muslims. Israeli Arabs, and even with those with Palestinian identities, want to be Israeli. They don't want to live Israel. 85% of them, they were given a choice, because there was this idea put forth that maybe when we're doing swaps of territory, your village will now be included under a new Palestinian state. They said, no, I'm an Israeli. I'm an Israeli. They want to be Israelis. The amount of terrorists that have grown from within the indigenous Israeli Arab Palestinian population is negligible. They've been loyal citizens of Israel. That they don't sing Hatikva? It's true. My coming home wasn't the fulfillment of their 2,000-year-old dream. My coming home was actually a Nakba for them. It was a catastrophe. They were doing just fine, or they were happy, and they weren't interested in me coming in. Go to Yafo today. They don't need me there. And now gentrification of Yafo, and it's getting more expensive. They were fine beforehand. I understand that it's not that Israel, they're not Zionists, but they're loyal citizens of Israel. Now the state of Israel, as a Jewish democracy, is the homeland of the Jewish people and the state of all of its citizens. Every country is the state of its citizens. That's what it means to be a modern country. So if we want to be a shul, go back and live in diaspora. Be a shul and pick who your members are. If you want to be a country, anybody who's a citizen, your country is the country of its citizens. We have to be, we're not Zion, grow up, we're a country. And in our country, there's Jews, and in our country, there's Arabs. So Haredim, my problem with Haredim, I want to fund, I'm even more radical. I don't even want to draft them to the army if they don't want to be drafted in the army. I don't have a problem. My only difficulty is if they believe, they could tell me how to live Jewishly. I want to protect Haredi rights. Israel has to be a tapestry of its multiple groups. Now, the president said that there were 4 tribes. It was funny. There's actually 57 tribes. there's every sub-Jew. He thought it was simple, but there was Haredi, There's religious Zionists, secular, and Arab. There's actually 57 tribes. But our coming home is going to challenge us to make space for everyone. Now, my job is, how do we create a Torah of Judaism that makes sense of this? How do we create a Torah of Judaism that embraces the non-Jewish citizens of Israel as equal citizens? And how do we create religious pluralism in our country? Not just in theory, but also in laws, that every Jew, that every rabbi could perform marriages, that every rabbi could perform conversions, that every rabbi and every Jew has an ability to live their Jewish life to the fullest, even if I don't want to live there, even if I don't want to go to your shul.
And it's commanded in the text, Zachor, remember that you were a non-citizen, a foreigner in a foreign country. We say that.
Exactly. And now it's even more, Sally, because they're not strangers, they're my citizens.
Right.
And so I know, so from far, and we know this, every book you read, there's the Muslim who's the terror. It's the vilification is easy. And listen, and in Israel, part of the challenge is that there are Arabs who want to, I live with the ongoing experience that somebody wants to kill me. Not in theory, somebody wants to kill me. And there are Muslims who want me dead. But that doesn't mean that every Muslim wants me dead. And in the borders of Israel, my job is to create a different spirit. And so the spirit of what I say, we argue but don't leave the room. We argue but don't exclude anybody from citizenship in the state of Israel.
That's a great message to end with. Now, as I hinted before, one last thing that I ask the rabbis that I interview is to sing one melody, Zmira song that comes from a place of significance. Usually is from the tish of your parents or your grandparents. Please, if you have something you want to sing for us, it will be maybe worth the whole hour plus of this conversation, because we know that la'avod Hashem et Hashem besimcha, and what better simcha is than singing something.
It's interesting. There is one, when you ask what is a nigun that I remember. My parents moved to Montreal. My grandparents lived in New York. They moved from Jerusalem in 1929, and they moved back in 1966. And I really grew up without my grandparents. I met them once or twice at a Passover, at a Pesach Seder, when I remember my grandfather singing the songs at the end. He would sing them in Arabic, because that's what his first language was Arabic, not Hebrew. And I remember when my grandfather died, my father said to all of us, the Shabbos table was a major part of my Jewish life. He says, I want to teach you my father's song. And he taught me the song. It was called Kol Mekadesh Shavi. Kol Mekadesh Shavi. Kara ilo. Kol Shomer Shabbat Kodesh. Kadat Mechalelo. And it goes on.
Go on.
Oh, it's good. I'm good. And I know. And I remember how important it was for me to learn that song. And I remember teaching it to my children. And part of what I learned that song aesthetically, when I teach it because most songs have a short stanza and then it repeats itself. This song has it just goes on, and sometimes it goes to the left. It makes no musical sense.
It's Jewish.
It was my grandfather's song. And for some crazy reason, not a crazy reason, it was important. My father, with all of his revolutionary tendencies, he wanted to teach us, he wanted us to know the song of his grandfather. And I wanted my children to know the same. And part of those songs, they don't have to be nice songs, Sally. It doesn't have to be a beautiful song. Shlomo Carlebach's tunes are much more joyful. But Kol Mekadesh will always be essential nigun in my life.
It's actually very beautiful because it gets people to join in, and you can read it and sing, and we can do the first stanza together.
No, I'm done with my singing.
Come on.
No, we're good. I love you, but not that much.
Now we know the limits.
Now we know the limits. Sally, it was really nice being with you. And thank you for inviting me to join.
I know that conversations with people are a bridge, and when you do it with your friends, it makes relationship internal, and I'm eternally grateful for this opportunity and for any chance for us to talk. just for a chance for you to pitch things that I have enjoyed over the years, which is the conferences online and in real life. You have once a year, this week long. Tell us more about it. I don't remember the name of it.
In Jerusalem, we invite Jews from around the world to come study together in June, together with rabbi. We have programs for rabbi, but there's one program for anybody who could afford it to come and to study some of the central issues of our time. People want to. My podcast that I now have called For Heaven's Sake, together with Yossi Klein Halevi and
who I interviewed here and I love dearly.
Yeah, and Ilana Steinhain. I don't know who you should interview.
Yes, we will. You have to.
She's a great lady. So listen, there's today with technology, there's so many ways for us to learn with people that we never had before, and so join in any way you can.
If you just search Donniel Hartman or Shalom Hartman Institute,
go to our website. It's all there.
What is the name of the annual thing that you do, which you have like a week-long sessions on every topic possible? What is it called?
The Community Leadership Program, CLP.
And it's online, right?
Now, during COVID times, it was online.
Keep it online.
We're going to keep parts of it online, and inshallah, this summer, depending, we're going to welcome people back here in Jerusalem again.
And the beautiful thing about it is that you can go into rooms where the topics that you never heard before, of people you never heard before, and you can become lifelong devotees of those people and learn and totally grow and evolve and smile, because you get to hear and abide and listen and to understand things that you never thought you'll agree with, inshallah.
Or learn from, yes.
Hashem. Thank you, my friend. Send regards. Really nice. Much love. Thank you so much.
Shalom.